Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast. My name is Chris Muntz, the host of the show, and this is episode 40, When Artists Have to Learn Science. When science gets thrust into the center of our world, our artistic world, how do we react? How do we gather information? What sources do we go to? How do we then use that information to decide what to do? I know that many of us look for other people to tell us when things are safe and tell us what to do. But ultimately, when the rubber hits the road, there are many situations in our lives beyond even this COVID pandemic that we're currently in which case we have to look at the world around us as a scientist would and decide what to do. So for this episode, you are going to hear a, I think, refreshing and upbeat conversation with the youngest guest that I've had on this show, and that's Nick Sienkiewicz. Nick Sienkiewicz is a young master's student in choral conducting who is a unique member of our profession in the sense that his undergraduate degree is in science. It's a scientific degree in bioengineering. He's even spent time working in a vaccine laboratory as an intern. So what we're going to be discussing today is just the scientific process and how it applies to our choral pandemic situation, our, I guess you could say, pandicament that we are currently in. We're figuring out how and when to go back to singing. What is the safest way? What are the less safe ways? What are the relevant bits of scientific information that we need to focus on in order to make rational decisions? Because we know not all the decisions will be made by someone else, one of our superiors or bosses or whatever. There are still decisions that we are going to need to make. So what is the process for that? And I just do want to give some disclaimers before you hear this conversation. There are several things, as for anyone who's been listening to this show for any period of time, you know that there are several things that have frustrated me with the way we are as a profession making our decisions. Where are we getting this information? What type of importance are we placing on this information? Because quite frequently, conversations that I've had on this show with doctors and experts that has not seemed to match up with the overarching trends of our thoughts as a profession and what we seem to be doing, what seems to be guiding our thought process. And that's been a frustrating thing. But I do want you to understand as you hear this conversation, if I go off on a little bit of a vent, make sure that you understand that if the shoe fits, wear it. I know that not everyone in the choir world is an active Facebook participator. So when I create or when I form my opinions about what the choir world, in air quotes, is thinking and doing, the only source of information I have on that is what I see on social media and the conversations I have in real life. And those of you who choose to write in your opinions to the show, which of course is always extremely appreciated. Feedback on this show is really important. In fact, there are all kinds of ways that you can give feedback to the show, writing in choralosophy@gmail.com, leaving comments or ratings on the various apps that you use to interact with the show, whether it be on the YouTube channel, the Apple Podcasts app. I'm going to read you some of those in a second that I've had over the course of the last year and a half. On Facebook, of course, is a really easy way to leave comments when you see the episodes posted. You can also rate the show, give it a ranking out of 4 stars, 5 stars, whatever, on the variety of apps. And those are all good ways for me to gauge your response to the stuff we're presenting here. That being said, it is very, very important that we have a non-biased, very almost, I don't want to scare anyone away with this thought process, but cold and calculated scientific approach to this, where we are giving equal weight to the things that are favorable to continue singing, as we are to the things that should cause us to pump the brakes, turn the steering wheel in a different direction, and try different things. But what we need to realize, if we are approaching this scientifically, all of those things are out there. There are factors or variables that could cause us to make different decisions. So the question becomes, how do we find them? How do we get enough information to where we think we could make a decision that is rational and that is sound? So Nick and I will kind of hash that out, the process, and he's even got some awesome tools and a step-by-step process as a scientist that he uses and relies on to make sure that he's reading and understanding good information that is relevant to the topic. But before we get to Nick, we're going to shout out the sponsors of this show and encourage you, as we're getting ready to go back to school, to hit them up and patronize these awesome companies that are on board supporting and helping get you this content. And we turn around and we support them by using the Choralosophy discount code, which helps you get a discount, which is great, but it also helps them know that you're listening, helps keep that relationship solid and sound between myself and the sponsors. It's a huge help. Probably the biggest thing that you can do is anytime you need the certain products that fall into those categories, that you remember to use those services and use that Choralosophy discount code. So what are these sponsors? The newest one, of course, mymusicfolders.com. Mymusicfolders.com has a ton of choir supplies. So folders, pencils, basically anything that you could imagine using in your choir classroom, they've got all that stuff. But they also, of course, have, during the pandemic, COVID supplies. They have an entire section on their website of just COVID classroom supplies, including types of masks that range in prices, all the way up to their Cadillac of masks, which is the resident singer's mask, which, by the way, very favorable recent aerosol study came out to talk about how much singing with a mask does reduce the overall risk in the classroom. And they talked about the big factors that make that mask work are all the things that the resonance mask has, which is a tight seal around your face, high quality fabric materials, and you even have the option of putting in filters to add an extra layer of protection for you and your singers. So highly recommend mymusicfolders.com. Also, you're heading back soon, sightreadingfactory.com. You've got to have those memberships set up for the first day of school, whether it's online, whether it's hybrid, whether it's in person. A membership for yourself, membership for your singers at sightreadingfactory.com gets you 10% off when you use Choralosophy discount code. As many times as you use it, there is no limit. So hit them up. Now, we are finally getting to the place where some choirs are going to be singing and some choirs are going to be doing virtual work. There are sheet music needs that you're going to have in the next few months. So don't forget to head over to graphitepublishing.com. They have recently put out a newsletter that highlights some very specific pieces in their catalog that they think would be really, really good for distance learning and or hybrid learning. And the cool thing about Graphite is that one of the ways you can access things like that on their website is they have this cool feature where the search engine allows you to tweak what they show you based on the difficulty level and voicing of what you're dealing with. So I know I'm going to have to be dialing back the difficulty of quite a few things because I'm going to be seeing my singers less. So it allows me to kind of set a parameter of I want to look at all the pieces that are level 2 difficulty or level 1 difficulty, or for only 2 voices or 3 voices. It's a great thing over there at Graphite. Plus their stable of composers is just awesome over there. You've got Tim Takash and Jocelyn Hagan, of course, and Eric Barnum, Joshua Shank, so many more over there that you're going to want to check out in time for school to start. Also, you can get some sheet music from RyanMain.com. Ryan has his own website where he publishes his own stuff, and you can get a 10% off discount there as well on what he does, or there's a site license for the music that you buy. You then own the PDF and can print as many copies of it as you want forever. So that's an awesome resource as well. Finally, Voce Vista Video is an amazing software product where you can show your students their overtones. It's basically a highly detailed picture of the sound. I use this in class on a regular basis as well as in voice lessons to help kids visualize what the sound wave should look like when they create it. By showing it to them live in the room while they're singing, they can actually make adjustments to vowel shapes and resonance visually by making certain lines light up and patterns appear on the screen. It's pretty amazing how quickly they can get the sound to be right just by watching and seeing it on the screen. So if you want to check that out and play with it, you can go to vocevista.com /Choralosophy. It's going to take me a while to get that right. And then you can download the software for free and play with it for 30 days before they make you pay for it. Once you do decide to buy it, you can enter Choralosophy at checkout to get your discount. The patreon.com /Choralosophy is a chance for you to directly contribute to the costs of running this show and to its overall sustainability, and maybe sometimes just because you appreciate the content that's happening on this show. So for as little as a cost of a coffee, a Starbucks coffee a month, $3 gets you in the door, and you have access to the behind the scenes shows there, episodes, behind the scenes content, extra content, as well as just an off social media chance to ask questions and create dialogues there. And that's a really cool thing. The Patreon also offers a producer level for this show. The producers of the show are David Kowalczyk, James Mock, Steve and Kathy Kokachik, Kyle Peterson, Michael Herron, and Ryan Main. Thanks so much to the folks over at Patreon. They really keep the lights on and make everything tick around here. Well, I'm here with Nick Sienkiewicz, and Nick is a choral musician / scientist, which is so weird, right? We're all supposed to be just pigeonholed and just be artists. So Nick, you don't seem to fit that mold. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and how those two worlds got mingled for you?
Sure. So I grew up in a place called Romeo, Michigan, which is about an hour north of Detroit, but like a million miles away. It's a very rural area. And when I was younger and up until probably about 8 months ago, I thought I was going to be a physician. And so all of my training up to when I went to college was in math and in science and technology and all that sort of thing. Well, when I went to college at Western Michigan University, I was sitting in a scholarship interview, and the board, at the time I was just going to be a biochemistry major, and the board that I was sitting with, they asked me, if you couldn't do biochemistry, what would be your next pick? And I said music, choral music education is what I started it as. And they were like, well, why don't you do both? And they ended up giving me enough funds to where I was able to pursue both. And so I went to Western and just graduated with degrees in biochemistry and a minor in biology, and also a degree in music, a bachelor's in musical arts focused in voice. And so at my time at Western, I did a lot of music things, and I also did a lot of science things. And so on the music side, I was and continue to serve virtually the Unitarian Universalist Community Church as their music director, doing choir, doing Sunday services, things like that. I also served as a choir director for the Kalamazoo Children's Chorus, their Coro de Niños, which is a bilingual children's chorus. So we did instruction and music primarily in Spanish. And also on more the art side, I serve as the executive director and co-founder of a theater nonprofit. So that's sort of the artistic side. But on the science side of things, very different. I was a research assistant at Western in a medicinal chemistry laboratory. And so I worked on synthesizing organic drug compounds, essentially, and also did cell-based assays, so test experiments dealing with cancer cells, PCR, all that sort of thing for about 2 years. I also served as a vaccinology and protein intern at a large global animal health company. And actually, I just got done this past month serving as a camp leader, kind of an instructor for the American Chemical Society's Project Seed program, which gives students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds experience in the chemical sciences. So I've done a little bit of both.
Well, that's amazing. And when Nick reached out to me, when you sent me this email mentioning that you'd been listening to some of the COVID episodes we've done on this show and kind of sharing some of your experience as a scientist who is also in the choral music world, it became immediately interesting to me because my first thought was, what an amazing, because you're a pretty young guy, right? You're what?
20? I'm pretty young. I just turned 21, actually.
Okay. So of course, my first thought was, why should my audience listen to this young guy? Right.
Agreed.
Yeah. But here's why I thought it was interesting. What a strange time for a person like yourself to enter the choral music world and thinking about it as a profession than right now during this pandemic, and how much even stranger it must be to enter a world of artists with a scientific background right when all of a sudden the artist community cares about science all of a sudden.
Mm-hmm.
Science impacts us in our daily lives now more than it ever has before as artists. And so I thought, wow, this is going to be an interesting story. Let's talk through some of the things that you're noticing, even as a young guy, but somebody coming into this world, into our world, that many of us old fogies with the gray hair have been in this world for a long time. But we're now having conversations about, all kinds of nerdy science things that we're probably not qualified to discuss, but they impact us on a day-to-day basis. So I thought that was very interesting. Let's start by having you kind of share first. Well, actually, I do want to mention in the early before we get into the weeds too much. Did I notice that you're also doing a podcast?
I was, and I continue to do it a little bit back and forth, but I will be pursuing my master's in choral conducting this fall at University Bloomington, and I'm also going to be serving as a researcher in their music and mind lab. And so that's something that's always interested me. And so I started a podcast with one of my other choral educator friends, Aaron, and we kind of do episodes surrounding how music affects the brain and things like that.
Oh, okay, that's great. Yeah, that's you get to keep those two interests of yours alive. Then it sounds like, which is really cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so help us understand what inspired you to reach out to me about this topic and the types of things that you were noticing, maybe just as a person with a scientific background jumping into the art community, in relationship to the basic way we've been discussing scientific issues.
Sure. So I think that primarily the reason I reached out is because, especially in the choral world and even in the arts world right now, as you mentioned, we're using a lot of science to try to either to support our programs, or not support singing, or trying to find things to support choral singing. And so the thing I've been noticing in the treachery that is going on Facebook, is the idea that everybody is super uncertain right now, and we are all in this place of uncertainty, and so we are trying to grasp for things that are certain. So whenever we see information that could potentially, either negative or positive, potentially impact us, we tend to pull for that information. And so the thing I was noticing is that, especially on the Facebook pages that I've been seeing, is individuals taking information, specifically scientific information, that might not be wholly relevant or validated for their specific circumstance. And so they're kind of pulling information that might be there or that might not be there, from a variety of sources, from peer-reviewed journals, non-peer-reviewed articles, videos, doctors, all these people talking to try to piece together what could possibly be helpful for the situation.
Yeah. So in other words, grasping at straws, so to speak, to support a position using information that doesn't mean what they think it means.
Absolutely. And it doesn't necessarily relate to the fact that it doesn't mean what they want it to mean, but the idea that it does have important information, it just may not be wholly applicable based on the variables that were tested in the experiments, for example.
Can you pull any examples out of your brain?
Sure. I remember seeing a post a few weeks ago, on they basically, I believe it was a peer-reviewed paper, and they were trying to see how long the virus lasted in the air. And so they're trying to see how long the virus lasted in the air. And so basically what they did, and from my understanding, I've read a lot of papers, so I hopefully don't get it confused, but they took rats, right? They infected them with the coronavirus. They put them in little containers, and then they routed all of their aerosol, or droplets, into what is called a Goldberg drum, which is a very insulated container. It has no light, it has no ventilation, and then they wanted to see how long the virus lasted. And I believe they said it's something upwards of 16 hours the virus could last in air. And somebody had posted this and said, well, this is really bad news. And I commented, and I often don't, because it's hard sometimes to get involved, but it's hard not to, because you want to educate people, you want to give people another perspective on what's to do. And so I let them know that, this is a very isolated situation. You are taking the virus and you are putting it in a literal drum. There is no ventilation, there is no light. There's all these other factors that could potentially play into this thing lasting for up to 16 hours. And I commented that, and I let them know that based on the information, and they commented back with, well, I wouldn't be so sure. And they posted an article that wasn't peer-reviewed, didn't list any sources for peer review, but was in support of the idea that it lasted 16 hours. And so I think that's a prime example of looking at the variables and kind of taking them out of context.
Right. Yeah. And I've got some that I could add. And I think it ties into um, what ends up being, I think, wrongly. How do I want to say this without hurting someone's feelings? It ends up being wrongly attributed to a distrust in science itself. But I don't
Mhm.
think that's really what's happening. I think it comes more from a not understanding how to read science. And then when you read the science, and then the results that you thought were going to come from what you understood in that scientific paper don't play themselves out in the real world. And then people start to kind of over time think, well, I guess, well, scientists don't know what they're talking about. But in reality, it wasn't the scientist's fault that you misread the paper.
Mhm.
I see that happening in our world right now a lot. So, and not even just choir world, just the society at large. So one of the examples from pretty recently is because I think the media doesn't do us any help with this either, because in fact, I recently read a Columbia study that about 60% of people who share news articles don't read past the headline at all, as in shared based on headline alone, which
Mm.
should alarm anyone. Like that should be alarming. But one of the ones that I've seen floating around almost to a viral degree recently was this one where the headline essentially was that most COVID survivors have, like, even the survivors of the disease have heart damage. And then which of course is not true, but it got shared a lot. And then you go into the article if you actually choose to read it, and then there's a link to the study. If you actually read the study, what you're determining, or what you learn, most people don't, but what you learn is in that particular headline was pulled from a study of 100 patients in a case in a country now with over almost 5 million cases. And so, as I think, as you said earlier, those types of little isolated uh, scientific bites of information, it's not that they're not important to know about, but it's the mistake that lay people make. And feel free to tell me that this is not the right way to look at it. I feel like it is, though. Is that it's not that we shouldn't know that information. It's that we shouldn't then attempt to extrapolate it out to the broader population because that sample size was so small. Does that make sense as a way to
I
analyze?
absolutely, yeah, I absolutely agree with that. Um, I think it's very difficult, and even as a scientist, actually we just had a whole unit on it when I ran this camp for American Chemical Society. As a chemist, it's really hard to read biology papers. Let me tell you, it takes me hours. And you can ask any of my colleagues. It takes hours to sit down and read those sorts of things. It's the same thing for a biologist to go and read a physiology paper. It's extremely difficult, and so the idea that, like you said, it's important to try to look for all the information, things like sample size and statistical significance. But those are things that we're really not taught if we're not going into science, or it takes a lot of effort to do that. And some people, we just don't have the time
Mhm.
or the effort or the will to go through and do that because we feel like we shouldn't need to. We feel like we should have to be able to, we should trust other sources to extrapolate that information for us when that's not necessarily the case sometimes.
Yeah, and especially factor in, like, for example, I like that you just pointed out that even for a person with a scientific background, reading information or a study or a paper from within a scientific background that is not your own is even difficult, let alone having an artistic background with no training in statistical relevance, with no training in methodology of a scientific study. And I think I've voiced this on the show before, but one of my pet peeves is even, and I think is very revealing when I see somebody post something making reference to, quote, the science, unquote,
Mm.
because to me that reveals a very deep misunderstanding of how science works. Science is not a monolithic community. People who are highly credentialed and experts within their field will still disagree on how to apply information from a study. They will disagree on what the results of the study really mean in the real world. They will disagree how to apply that study. There's this idea that there is an oracle on a hill called the science that we must all kind of defer to, I think is a very dangerous thing. And it's been laid bare during this pandemic, in my opinion, because you get, this idea that we should know in advance which scientists have gotten it right during the outbreak of a brand new virus on the planet, that we should have been encouraging all of this discussion and disagreement among scientists. And so I think that does play in also to what you were saying, what we were both discussing earlier about some people, you take that kind of dissonance in their brain to not trust science. But on the other side, sometimes people can kind of fetishize any person with like a bunch of letters after their name with their scientific degree or whatever, says a thing that confirms their bias. They will trust that scientist and ignore all the other scientists. And I think we're doing that a little bit right now. And you mentioned this earlier, where people, you see on Facebook, people kind of grasping at straws and posting articles that seem to boost, in our world right now, it's either to boost the opinion that singing is safe and we're all just freaking out, or to boost the opinion that singing is not safe, and it doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter how much social distancing you do. And it doesn't matter if you wear a mask. If you sing it near someone, you will kill them. Like we have this like huge disparity going on. And in reality, we're probably going to discover that the truth is somewhere in the middle. What do you think about that?
I absolutely agree. And there's still a lot of information, like you said, that we really don't know, as far as singing goes. We don't know on the science side even how many viral particles it takes to infect somebody. Is the biggest one that we're not aware of right now, and that's really the key to all of this. I think is that understanding how much it really takes, how long of an exposure time it takes, and going back to your idea of trusting somebody with a PhD behind their name. I don't even think that's just in the choral world as well. We're seeing that with the things like the Plandemic video with Dr. Judy Mikovits, the Frontline doctors with the videos that most recently posted, where you have these people who are supposed to be trusted individuals who we're really supposed to trust because they have those credentials, they have the experience, and they're sending out misleading information in order to sway public opinion on a certain idea. When you go further and you look at what they're actually saying, it doesn't make much sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that actually ties very closely into what I was saying before. Your theory and mine seem to be pretty well lined up. Does that make sense?
I agree.
Yeah.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And a conversation I was actually having with one of my colleagues the other day is you see a lot, we get a lot of, as I mentioned before, we have a lot of sources that we're taking information from. And one of the most accessible sources and one of the most, I guess, clickbait sources is watching videos, right? You see scientists or individuals wearing a lab coat, and you go and you look at that video because you think it might be important. And it's not to say that they don't have credible information, because there's a lot of videos out there that are really educating people on, scientific literacy and how this virus works and, all those sorts of things. But when you look at data, and this is just in a very opinionated thing, and I understand that it's a time where we're trying to publish very quickly because we need this information to be accessible. And so scientists are working really hard to get these experiments done and get them thoroughly done so that they can be peer-reviewed and published. And so I fully acknowledged that that's a long process. But the idea is that if you want data to be presented in a valid way and a way that can be looked at by other scientists, you should publish, or you should go through the publishing process. Mm-hmm. Presenting data through a video that has not been peer-reviewed, or presenting data before peer review that hasn't gone through experimentation or validation or statistical tests, you should always be skeptical of. And you should always go further and look at that information. Because if, like with the frontline doctors, for example, they came through and said, you don't need to be wearing masks, coronavirus it's not as bad as you think it is, all this sorts of things that they were coming through, and they were physicians, And then it's like, why didn't you go further? Or like with hydroxychloroquine, they said that it's a cure, right, for coronavirus. Why not go further and present or put that information into a poster and present that information to the public in a way that we can validate it?
Mm-hmm. Right. So your suggestion then is that in a lot of ways we're in an environment where because of the need for the speed of information, we've become kind of a scientific Wild West where where there's just people are just throwing stuff out in all kinds of social media type of format of content, which perverts the process that normally science goes through.
Agreed.
Yeah.
I absolutely agree with that.
Yeah. And I do, it's interesting because with kind of taking this back to the choral context a little bit, one of my frustrations has been that we've seemed to have, well, let me just put it, this is anecdotal, but I've probably had close to 1,000 or so interactions with choral directors during this pandemic about this topic, whether it be through emails to the show, Facebook interactions, conversations in Facebook groups, private Facebook messages, just the whole thing. And one of the most interesting things is that I've discovered that I've only come across maybe 2 or 3 out of that group that can accurately frame the epidemiological issues with the virus in the first place. And that concerns me. In other words, so for those of you just listening who are not sure what I mean, so if you can't accurately describe what the statistical likelihood that is that a person would die from the virus, would get sick to the point where they would go to the hospital from the virus, then I'm concerned about whether or not all of your other logical conclusions from what you should do right now are being put on solid ground. Because, and here's why, that's how we decide everything else. In other words, like with any disease on the planet, the epidemiological gold standard is mortality and hospitalization. That's how they decide how much we should do about a virus. And what I'm concerned about right now is that I seem to see almost like a new all of a sudden reaction, which is that if you try to talk to somebody about those critical issues that a year ago would have been the standard epidemiology 101, this is how we discuss a virus, is now, well, I don't care about those percentages and that information. What matters is that somebody could die. Well, yes, I share that concern, but if we're going to make rational decisions, I think we kind of have to at least educate ourselves about those things. And so to me, it's been interesting to have these conversations that I've had on this show with people who are internationally recognized as being experts in this field, and they will present information that where I've been trying to do, and like what we're doing right now, is to try to give people a broader context for this conversation. And it's been surreal for me to almost like I'm living in an Orwell novel. I've got to be honest, where I will get information from these doctors and from these experts and have all these hours and hours and hours of conversation to try to understand. And then I'll present the information and have choir directors telling me that those people on my show don't know what they're talking about. And I've even had, this has been really funny. One of the doctors made himself, Dr. McKenzie, who was in episode 36, made himself very available to me back and forth before and after the show. Like we were having tons and tons of conversations that I did not record. And one of the most bizarre experiences in my professional life has been having to write him emails that essentially have the energy of, my choir friends don't believe you. Can you explain this again on some kind of scientific issue that he's an expert on? And oftentimes there are people who claim to be following the science in air quotes. And so I'm interested to see if this idea that you presented right at the very beginning, which is that you're going on Facebook and you're seeing people seeming to grab scientific information that supports their biases rather than what supports how science should work, what would be your advice to an artist without scientific training on how to find good information that is applicable to what we have to do as choral musicians, and what types of things should we avoid when we're trying to track down that information?
Sure. So my number one recommendation always is, if possible, and it's hard to do right now because there's a lot of information. Like I said, a lot of it is coming fast because science is trying to catch up. But my number one recommendation is always to go to the primary source. Always. Whether it's a peer-reviewed journal or it's a podcast conversation or whatever it is, always go to the primary source to validate what the individual actually said or what the study actually showed. The overall, I'll talk about a couple other tips I can give, but the overarching theme, I guess, is to always be skeptical of the information that is presented to you, 100% of the time. Even in science, when a new paper is published on a topic that's never been looked at before, it's really not accepted by the scientific community until it is validated by another experimenter and until we can repeat those experiments. And so it's really important, especially with all the new information that's coming out, to be skeptical of all the information that you see and always at least go to another source and try to validate that information. Mm-hmm. When you're going through these peer-reviewed papers, they're really hard to read. They're so hard to read. They're full of technical jargon that you normally don't associate. They're full of assays and tests and experiments that have their own errors, that have their own problems that we're not familiar with. So for example, like the error of running a gel, right? Or what a gel shows, like when you run a gel and you have little DNA strands on it, what does it even show? What are the problems behind that sort of basic scientific experiment? Those are really hard to read. And so the first tip I have is, if you don't have a lot of time and you're going through this, you got the peer-reviewed paper, you find it, you always ask yourself 3 questions. The first one is, who was it written by? So always look at the people who wrote it. You can look at their credentials, see what they're in for, all that sort of thing. The other thing that you want to look for is, who is it funded by? Usually at the bottom of papers, peer-reviewed papers, they have a section called conflicts of interest. And generally, depending on the journal that you're in, they might have it called something differently. But they always have some sort of conflicts of interest there. So you can look and see, was this funded by a federal grant, which a lot of them are. So, those are pretty good. There's not a lot of pull there because a lot of the information, or a lot of the money comes from, places like the NIH, the NSF, the CDC, those places. And then the final thing is to look for when it was written. I see this happen a lot, especially with individuals, you don't go to an article date. And they post something that was like, oh, this person died. And then you look and the person died 5 years ago, right? So always look at when it was written for relevance. So if it was written 25 years ago, you might have to take a step back and go, okay, what methods did they use, and are they applicable to me today?
Well, yeah. Sorry, I'm going to interrupt for just a second because that's a really good point. I'm still seeing the articles that came out immediately after the May 5th webinar still being posted to this day, despite how much more information we now know. And in our environment, you're talking about an article that might have been written 25 years ago. In our current environment, articles written in May are probably wrong now. It's changing so fast. But yeah, go ahead.
No, yeah, absolutely. And I absolutely agree with that. The best example I can give is another little Facebook thing. I mean, 2 of my scientist friends, she's a PhD student at Western, also in a medicinal chemistry laboratory, and she commented on a post of this individual who said that masks weren't effective, and she linked an article. She linked a peer-reviewed journal article. And so, we went and we did a little digging, and the article was written, I believe, in 2010. And it evaluated all respiratory illness in a healthcare setting, and was evaluating the use of masks. And so basically what they did is they tried to see if masks were effective in preventing all sorts of respiratory illness, and it was done 10 years ago. And so it's just that sort of thing that you really want to watch for when you try to evaluate these things. And so you've gone through that, you looked at your funded and your authors and your date. And the easiest way to get information from all those things, because it's hard to go through and read it, is always to read the abstract first. Because the abstract always presents you with the goal of the experiment, overview of the methods that were done, and the results. So it'll give you an idea of purpose and method and the results of the experiment. And so that'll give you a pretty good idea of how significant was this change, or how important is this. And if you're really, really skeptical, if you're like, okay, I want to go further with this, then always read the discussion. The end of the discussion section in a paper is so important. Usually, and all authors are different, but usually they start the discussion by talking about their results. And then at the end of their discussion, they talk about the need for future research, or the need for more validation, and also some problems that they ran into in their experiment. And good science will acknowledge the problems that they ran into and the things that you cannot pull from that information. And so to go through that and kind of make your own assumptions from there.
Right. Yeah, that all makes total sense. I feel like one of the things that I've noticed is that, so I'm going to take this back to that Columbia study I mentioned before. I think we have a hierarchy, just to kind of summarize everything what you just said, is definitely don't share the article without reading the article. So we've got I'll add a step A before your step one. And I only mention that because I do see it happening, obviously, quite a bit. And then if you're going to read, and so I'm going to add the media piece into this, because you were kind of talking about how to read a scientific paper. A lot of us in the choir world are not even reading the scientific paper, I'm afraid. I think we're reading articles about the scientific paper. And that's where we're getting a lot of our information. That's even worse, because the news reporter, no offense to whoever the reporter might be, I don't think is any more qualified to read that scientific information than I am. So they're going to read the scientific paper with possibly as many flaws in their reasoning and their understanding of what's important out of that paper, and then they're going to write an article about it. And then the danger there, as I see it, is that then what is written in that article then becomes the scientific fact, and not what was in the paper in the first place, because of that kind of process that the average layperson goes through, which is that they think they're reading science when they're reading an article about science. Do you see that happening too?
I absolutely agree. And I think the thing is, even if they're a scientific reporter, even if it was me taking that information and writing an article about it, you always have to understand that that is an interpretation of another interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
When scientists do their experiments, in quantitative research specifically, so I'm talking about more, biology and chemistry and those things where we have actual numbers, rather than the qualitative research, which is more of the social sciences and psychology, which is just as valid, but just different in the way you approach it. In quantitative research, the goal essentially is to remove all other variables that could interfere with the experiment and also eliminate our own bias. However, there is also the idea that we are working with funds, and we are working with a purpose to publish, and we have an idea of what we want to, what the end result should look like. And so our discussion is just an interpretation of the actual results. And now that isn't to say that it's not valid, because it's extremely valid coming from the researcher. But then when you take another level of that and you have somebody interpreting that information and putting it on a news article or a media article or anything like that, it's just another level that you add of interpretation. So it's always important, like you kind of said, to always go to that primary source initially to make your own interpretation of what that data could look like.
Yeah, just what I do is when I see a clickbaity article that purports to be about science, I'll go ahead and click on it. I usually try to not read the article at all, and I just try to go into wherever if it links the study that the article is about, I will simply skip the journalist's opinion and go right to that. And then if I'm interested and if I do think that that's relevant, then I'll go ahead and read the article. I try to go backwards. That way I'm getting the scientist or the researcher's take first, and then coming back. And oftentimes, and this is, people might call me a conspiracy theorist on this, but oftentimes I find that when reading the study first and then reading the article, I find that the article says something very different than what the study said. There was another one that I found that went viral, which was that something about how a majority of asymptomatic COVID carriers have long-term illness. And then if you, which doesn't really make any sense on its face, because if they're asymptomatic, no, that's not what it was. It wasn't asymptomatic. It was of mild symptoms. People with mild symptoms have long-term illness. But if you read the study, it was a retrospective cohort study, essentially, where the healthcare providers called about 300 or 400 people on the phone and asked them how they were feeling. Which of course is good information, but that's not enough information to make a headline that says a majority of all, right? And what was interesting about that, if you read the study, the way that the researchers phrased that is that long term could be 3 weeks, and illness could be still feels like you have a cold. But then the news article gets presented as people are still like really, really sick for a long, long time. But so again, you get these different messages, because you mentioned this at the onset too, of how we're starting to know now more about, for example, you can't just walk through somebody's 6-foot bubble at the grocery store and catch COVID. That's not how it works. You've got to have a dose, like a significant enough dose of the virus to get sick. Well, how does that apply in our choral rehearsal? Figure out ways to reduce the dose. Get people spread out, ventilate the space, put masks on, and in those types of environments, I feel comfortable. That being said, we also have to acknowledge that not everyone has the same risk profile. Not everybody has the same personal risk tolerance. So I can speak for myself, but I don't want to pretend like I can speak for others.
Absolutely.
Any thoughts on that?
I know. I absolutely agree with the things that you are saying regarding your personal level of comfortableness, and the more that we know, we just keep getting more information about how we should approach at least choir. And I think the important thing too to recognize, and you kind of implied it in your talking, is that that's a you thing, right? And so that's your personal level of comfortableness with your instruction. And there are other individuals and other teachers in other areas who might not be comfortable with that,
right,
who might have smaller classrooms or a higher risk population, or have more COVID cases in their county,
yep,
have rising COVID cases. And so just to make the point and point it out there, just kind of the thing we're seeing with parents right now too, where they're deciding, should I homeschool my child? Should I put them back in school? What should I do? I think it's really important to support our teachers in the decisions that they make based on the information that we currently have, right? That's not to say that, like, if you have an instructor that puts all the kids in the room, not socially distanced, without masks for an hour, that's probably not the best thing. But the idea that if you put on masks, you do 100 square feet of space between each singer, and you do those things, that we have to support those teachers as well as the teachers that decide to do virtual. Because everybody's opinion is important, and we have to be able to recognize all of that and support those teachers in whatever decisions that they want to make.
Yeah, I agree. I feel and I understand that right now I've kind of gone off on a couple rants of my frustrations. This is kind of where my life is right now. But one of the things, and this is more ties it into the scientific reasoning stuff again, is that one of the mistakes I think that many of us are making, and I've talked about this on a couple of previous episodes, is that framing the risk around singing, or any risk related to COVID, as being a binary between safe and unsafe, was our first and most fatal mistake, I believe, as a profession. You're being asked to disprove a negative, to prove that in other words, it's a logical error. It's not a scientific error. To say that the way to justify singing again would be to prove that it's safe. And so I've been advocating for a mindset shift of what if we were thinking about how safe or how unsafe is a given rehearsal environment, and then we have to make a decision as singers and directors of where on that spectrum are we willing to return. And that ultimately, that's a political question not a scientific one. Somebody's got to either make that decision for me, or I have to make that decision for myself. And I'm worried that some of us want to be told at some point, okay, now singing is safe, before they go forward. And I'm afraid we're never going to get that information, which kind of leads us to the Colorado study. I want to discuss a little bit your thoughts on what might come out there. So I think we're recording on August 6th. I was told it was supposed to come out today. I don't know if it will. But what I'm concerned about is that we've put all of our eggs in that Colorado study basket. And many directors might be thinking that our only hope is if that study comes out and says it is safe to sing with a mask on or whatever. And I don't think it will. It'll tell us that it reduces the risk, like that. My prediction is that we're going to find out from that study that wearing masks works in reducing the risk, and puts it on par with some other activities that people are already doing, like wearing masks and sitting in an office somewhere, or sharing the same air, or going to the grocery store, or whatever. It's going to reduce the risk down to that level, but it's not going to tell us the risk is zero. And so I'm a little bit concerned about how we might choose to interpret that. Have you looked into that study at all?
I have, and I believe the only presentation that I saw was the one that was initially posted via the PowerPoint. I think it was probably for some research group meeting, because it looked very much in that style, with kind of the things thrown on there, and the titles that weren't capitalized, and it just brings me back to those days. But yeah, I have looked into that. I have looked into that study, and I definitely agree with that. I think the counter argument, or kind of the other perspective to that, is I think the useful information we'll get out of this. Is yes, it might mitigate risk enough to where it's on par with other activities, which would be great, which would be awesome for our profession to showcase that. But I think the opposite end of it, which I'm really interested in, is how unsafe really can it be? What factors, like without wearing a mask, could showcase that it could be a potentially unsafe activity? For example, the best example, I saw a video posted the other day by the College Conservatory of Music, that they did a study as well, evaluating the virus within a practice room. It was actually really interesting, where they looked at a singer, and they looked at a bunch of different instruments. And they basically took a singer and they evaluated the amount in the air 6 feet in front of them, 10 feet in front of them, and 6 feet to their sides. And basically what it showcased is that there was a higher amount of aerosol production from singing compared to other instruments. Which is plausible. I think we've known that for a while.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of stuff that it has to go through in order to get there. But the interesting thing, and I think the thing that was really important about that, was that they also put a HEPA filter in the room, and it reduced the amount of aerosols that were produced to a third of the baseline level.
Wow.
Which is incredible, which is a lot. And what it also showcased is that there was no difference between 6 feet to your side and 10 feet in front of you. And so the aerosol concentration was about the same, or what we say in science, what we mean by statistically significant, which means that in every measurement there are errors, and we have confidence interval bars, and so that those two were far enough apart, they were close enough together that they were about the same level. Whereas 6 feet, you had a higher aerosol concentration.
Mm-hmm.
And so what it kind of showcased is that with these risk mitigation strategies, like you're talking about, like wearing masks, it could potentially be in the same reign as other activities. And that's super important. And what I have yet to see is that this activity this activity with the mitigation strategies is just as dangerous, or is more dangerous, with wearing masks with a proper ventilation. Because if we did a study and we put a whole choir in a room and we did without the masks and without the social distancing, and we measured aerosol concentration, that would probably be very scary. And that would probably not be a good thing for us. But it's important to recognize those risk mitigation strategies that all other places are doing, whether it's in, or should be doing, whether it's in schools or in our grocery stores or anything like that, is to involve those risk mitigation processes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really well put. I had also in episode 36, Dr. McKenzie felt pretty confident in saying just essentially what you're saying. This was before the studies that you're talking about came out, which was that it was just his medical opinion, of course, but that if you were singing in a school, for example, with masks, that he couldn't imagine a scenario where having a choir meet in a school would change in any meaningful statistical way the overall risk profile of the whole school. So if you've got 1,000 people coming into the building and they're eating lunch and they're walking through the halls and they're going to math class and they're doing all these things, that you've got now this huge risk pool that to where having your choir go ahead and sing during that day would be like a drop in the ocean of the overall risk profile of the school. And I think that's ultimately, for those of us in the education side of singing, I think that's a really important point, is because we're trying to think about, for example, with this hysteria that we've put ourselves through, we could run into situations where full contact sports are allowed, going to the cafeteria is allowed, being in all the other classes allowed, but then they say no singing, which that might not be a very scientific way to look at the overall risk process of school. Whereas if you are, let's say, a community choir organization where singing is your only risk, well, then all of a sudden, singing becomes a huge portion of your risk that you're taking on. And this might be a different conversation. You mentioned this before too, where depending on who your singers are, if you are a church choir with an average age of 70, the risk you're taking on is very, very different. And so what I'm encouraging people to do who might be listening to this is to allow for some nuance in these conversations on a scientific level, to where we might acknowledge that a children's choir might sing before a church choir might, and have that risk profile be a different calculation. In other words, the inputs, I think, to use the scientific way of thinking about it, the inputs that we put into the experiment are not going to be the same in every singing situation.
Absolutely. And I think that it comes from an area of, as trying to decide what to do, that's really hard.
Mm-hmm.
And this is super stressful. I mean, even myself, I'm pretty anxious about going back to school and being in that choral setting, or teaching, and I'm sure many other instructors and students out there are feeling the same way. And as an instructor, trying to make these decisions when we may not have the scientific background, or we don't even have all the information. And that's the hardest part, is we don't have, like, for example, the really important thing, which is how much virus does it take to infect somebody, right? How much does it take in order for you to actually get infected? Because what we could find, for example, is that playing the trumpet, it releases enough aerosol in the right conditions to infect somebody. Or what we could find is that it takes 7 times more than a couple trumpet players to actually infect somebody. But what I think going forward, the thing that has to be recognized, like I said, is supporting the teachers in whatever decisions they make, but also the idea that when going about making decisions and trying to have this level of personal accountability, is go with what makes sense to you. There are a lot, and I think this another one of your talks, the COVID talks, mentioned this as well. There's a lot of common sense things that we know work, like, for example, masks, if they're accessible to you. In America, they're pretty accessible. In other places in the world, masks are not as accessible, and that's why, for example, the WHO has differing recommendations for mask wearing than the CDC.
Mm-hmm.
But doing the things that make sense, wearing masks, socially distancing. If that doesn't make sense for your classroom, then, maybe doing a virtual environment. But just trying to do what you can do with the information that you have. And that's really, really hard, especially when there's always risk involved.
Right. Now, why is, for you personally, I know that you wanted to have a kind of a voice in this conversation because you felt like you could add something that could help us understand this, as with your scientific background, because ultimately it sounds like you're of the mind that we have to have the arts, and we have to have these performing arts opportunities So, what are your thoughts on our need to use this scientific, an improved way of thinking about the scientific issues here as a way to advocate for the arts rather than tearing them down?
That's a really important question. I think that the biggest thing is that if we really want to be critical about these issues, we have to do the research ourselves. W- Um, we have to be able to go look at that information and generate our own opinions and thoughts about that information. Like you were saying, you call them inputs, or there are multiple variables that may have not been discussed or were put into the scientific process that don't necessarily relate to your situation at hand.
Mhm.
If we can't, go through those articles and understand that, my biggest suggestion is always to email the researchers, because you may not notice, but if you go to any linked journal article, most of the time they have their contact information linked on their actual name, and they're always most of the time willing to talk to you about their research, because they really enjoy their research and they really enjoy doing it and like the results. And because if you really want to understand a certain experiment or an assay, to go through and do that. And if you can't, email a science friend, or try to find somebody in the scientific community that may be able to help you understand that sort of information. So going back, I'm kind of talking about tips now, but going through and critically understanding the information ourselves is, I think, really important in arming ourselves to be able to support the arts, rather than to take the negative information that we've seen, starting with the Washington State Skagit County Choir, and kind of putting a really negative damper on singing, and using that information rather than that. So critically looking at all that information to be able to make our educated opinions about how we should go forward. Because, like you said, the arts are absolutely essential. And the argument I make, like you said, are they going to go somewhere else? Are they going to be put in a more at-risk environment? But the argument I make is that we're always in a battle for the arts. It seems like every day we are trying to find ways to support our programs, whether it's in schools or in the community or in the nation. I mean, I just read an article for the other day for that. I believe it was the fourth year in a row under the current administration. They removed the National Endowment for the Arts from their budget again. And it's just kind of this idea of like, we always have to keep fighting. And so what's the case if this goes on for the rest of next year? What's the case if this goes on until next summer, where organizations don't get that funding that's necessary, and we see the loss of a bunch of arts organizations? What's the case if something like this happens in the future, where we have another pandemic? And are we going to do the same thing? Are we going to just say, we're going to have to totally cut this out? We have another, illness that is done via respiratory particles. And the other ideas too is that our students and our communities need the arts. It's the way that and this is kind of I guess, a hoity-toity idea, not really going with the science, but our people need ways to cope.
Mhm.
The thing that was floating around for a while is that, if you don't recognize artists or don't think that arts are important, or not funding arts organizations during this time, to cancel your Netflix account, or to stop listening to music in the car, or to not go to a concert. It's just the idea that we need this stuff to be able to cope. We need it to understand our current situations. We need to have a sense of emotional output for our students. And there was a study, I know we're rambling now, but that was done by the University of Wisconsin during this pandemic, that looked at student athletes and depression and anxiety. And they found that I believe it was 56% of student athletes in the high school, after COVID happened and they couldn't participate in sports anymore, reported depression and anxiety. Now, that's not to say that correlation equals causation, right? The relationship between, cutting off school equals that depression and anxiety. But what it is to showcase is that our students, yes, they need math, history, English, and science. They need all of those things, but they also need ways to cope in school. They need those sorts of activities.
Absolutely. Yeah, my personal experience with this also would be anecdotal, but I think illustrative either way, as we kind of wrap this up on this concept, because I totally agree. The figuring out ways to sing in the safest possible way is not a luxury. It's essential, and it's essential for especially. I think it's essential for lots of people based on where they are in their life, but I'm going to put forth an idea that it's essential for young people in a way that is literally life and death. I have, this next year will be my 18th year as a public high school choir teacher. I have dealt with, on a very close and personal level, student suicide. I have counseled and talked off the ledge, metaphorically, a lot of students, at least one or two a year. I have had students, at least one or two a year, communicating to me that if it weren't for the environment of family that is built in a choir, they might not have survived through high school due to suicidal ideation. I'm really upset that pointing that out right now has become political, but that's probably an entirely different podcast. And so my way of looking at this has never been to say, what are the risks of COVID in singing, period. My way of looking at it has been, what are the risks of COVID in singing compared to what are the risks of not singing? Because I've seen it with my own eyes that with that teenage age cohort, of course, the teenage years are the highest risk of suicide. They need a chance to be together. And if that means for me in my class that we're spread out around a big room with, lots of distance and we're wearing masks, that act of making music in community makes a huge difference in their lives. And so I just don't want us to, you came on to talk about scientific stuff, but these other things are empirical questions also. They can be studied, they can be measured. What is the impact of isolation on us right now? And so I think it sounds like we're on the same page in terms of wanting to understand a way to not ignore the risks of COVID. We want to deal with that, but we also want to not treat the arts and performing arts opportunities as something that can just be cast aside. And that's really important. And for I think the reality, the bitter pill that a lot of us don't want to swallow is that yes, absolutely, we want to come up with all these online ideas that are going to keep kids engaged. But for a percentage of students, the online stuff's just not going to cut it. They are with us in our classes because of the personal connection. And without that personal connection, they just would take some other classes. I think it's easy for us as choir people to assume that everyone else is like wired in and committed to choir. But for people like me who have taught, a couple thousand high school age students, that represents a very small percentage of my students. Most of my students are there because of the social aspect. They're not there for the music. I convince them about the music later, but they show up initially because their friends are there. Right. Mm-hmm. And so without that element, I am concerned about losing some kids. So I've always been biased towards a middle road, like a middle road where we use science to make the rehearsal space as safe as possible, but we figure out some way to do it, to even if it looks and sounds really weird.
I absolutely agree. One of my favorite researchers of all time, Dr. Brene Brown, who's been very, very prevalent in probably the last 10 years or so, talks about that we're all hardwired for connection, and that's not a debatable thing. That's a neurobiological thing. Mm-hmm. We are all hardwired for connection, and we have to be able to connect with other individuals, which is why this pandemic has been so hard for a lot of us, especially in the choral world, because we're used to connecting with a large group of people who are vulnerable with us on a daily basis. Choir gives individuals the opportunity, and I actually came across this phrase while I was writing an article, but to generate a choral culture of connectedness. This idea that we have a group of students or a group of individuals or community choir, whatever it is, that is willing to be connected to others and also vulnerable in the same space. And that is extremely powerful. If you want to go away from the hoity-toity side of it, there's research that showcases kind of both ways, but there's research that showcases that participating in choir increases the level of oxytocin, which is related to levels of social bonding and connectedness and social flow. There's also other positive health benefits, which include increases in something called serum immunoglobulin A, which is an immune system antibody, essentially. So it ramps up our immune system. There's all good reasons to be able to participate in this sort of activity, and so kind of cultivating that idea that we do need to connect to other people, and that is essential. With balancing it, like you said, with the scientific side is absolutely vital.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. I couldn't have said it better, and that's I think a really great way to close this. I really appreciate your insight, especially again for such a whippersnapper. You are pretty well spoken. I don't know if that's ageist or not. I don't know, but yeah, I'm very impressed with your ability to articulate these ideas, and in a very helpful way that I think is really important. And obviously, my kind of approach to this throughout the last few months with the episodes that I've done is that I despise science. No offense, meaning that until now, like if I'm going to choose how to spend my mental energy, I'm a person who's going to default towards things like philosophy and economics, which is really just the study of human interaction. But I'm more of a humanist. I like to study those types of things. But I also, right now, science becomes more relevant to me because of what's going on. And so I've had to kind of do a lot of this deep dive of educating myself in how to become literate in science. And so this episode, I think, can be helpful for people in that way. And I really appreciate you being able to jump on and talk us through it. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
All right. Thanks a lot. Well, thank you as always for sticking around to the end of an episode. I hope that means you're still here because you enjoyed it, you enjoyed the conversation, and you enjoyed learning. This is a very important topic that I don't think is going to go away from our near futures. So the more scientifically literate we can become, I think we will start to make better and better choices. We will make our choirs safer. We will also be able to make our choirs productive. It doesn't have to be one or the other. We can try to take steps forward that dodge the landmine, so to speak, without running away from the field completely. And that's got to be our jobs, because many of us have to make those choices. We have to go forward. We have to make things work. We have to make the things that we're doing be as productive and safe as possible. And the way that we have to integrate all that information is a scientific process. There are also, as we talked about in the episode, things that are not scientific. We're going to have to make logical choices. We're going to have to make moral choices. What level of risk on the spectrum, as you heard me just say, are we willing to go back? That's not a scientific question. That's a moral question. And we all are responsible for that in our own lives. I wish I could tell you that there was someone to hover down over you and give you all the right answers. And that is definitely not what this show is all about. It is, again, to try to broaden the context. So if you appreciate the content that we are doing here and the project that the Choralosophy podcast represents, which means a broadening of topics and a broadening of context, we're doing that in all of the topics we cover on this show. The idea being that there oftentimes is a pigeonholed, very, very narrow frame in which we get to discuss a lot of topics in our profession on social media. But through a podcast medium, we can broaden that frame quite a bit. We can do it on race and diversity and inclusion issues. We can do it on COVID issues. We can do it on the nuts and bolts in the classroom issues. Once we get back there, once we get the chance to get those kids in our room again, we can have all of those topics related to our profession expanded and broadened by having these higher resolution conversations. So if you believe in that mission, here are the things that you can do to help. Number one is help us share the content. Share an episode that you liked. Go back through the feed to previous episodes, find your favorites, and share that. It doesn't have to be the most recent episode. You could go all the way back to Jason Ferdinand. You could go all the way back to Marcus Garrett. You could go back to the Don Brinegar episode about pitches and tuning systems. You could go to the Amanda Quist episode. There are so many great episodes in the feed of this show. It doesn't have to be the most recent. So go find something you liked and share it, because you never know. Sometimes the algorithm on the social media blocks people from seeing the content. Like it, give it a rating, hit up those sponsors, mymusicfolders.com, sightreadingfactory.com, vocevista.com, graphitepublishing.com, and ryanmain.com, and always use that Choralosophy checkout code. These are all ways that you can help move the process forward. And of course, last but not least, head over to patreon.com/Choralosophy and sign up for at minimum $3 to jump into that extra content over there and to show support. Thanks, everybody. Keep listening, and we'll be back at you next week.